You don't have a motivation problem, you have a pattern of abandoning yourself the moment effort becomes uncomfortable. You've done this more times than you want to admit. You start something with clarity, maybe it's a workout plan, a business idea, a new habit. The first few days feel controlled. You're aligned. You tell yourself, this time is different. Then something small happens. You miss one day. Or the result doesn't come fast enough. Or the effort feels heavier than you expected. And without saying it out loud, you quietly step back. You delay. You adjust. You tell yourself you'll restart properly tomorrow. But tomorrow becomes another starting point. Not a continuation, another beginning. That's the pattern. You don't fail loudly. You don't quit dramatically. You just stop finishing. And the cost isn't just the unfinished task. It's the identity you're reinforcing every time you walk away. You're training yourself to believe that starting is enough. That intention is progress. That effort only counts when it feels right. But it doesn't work that way. Finishing is where identity is built. Finishing is where self-respect is decided. Right now, your life reflects not what you start, but what you complete. And if you're honest, there's a gap between the two. This isn't about pushing harder or trying again with more energy. That's what you've already been doing. The problem isn't your ability to begin. The problem is the invisible system that pulls you out before the result. In this video, you're going to see exactly why you keep repeating this cycle, and more importantly, what has to change internally so finishing becomes your default, not your exception. Because until that shifts, you'll keep starting things that never become part of who you are. What's happening here isn't random. It's structured. And once you see the structure, you can't unsee it. There are 3 internal patterns quietly running every time you start something and fail to finish. The first is what's called a self-licensing loop. You begin strong, and that initial effort gives you a false sense of progress. You feel like you've already earned something. So when resistance shows up, you unconsciously give yourself permission to slow down, delay, or adjust. Not because you plan to quit, but because your mind believes you've already done enough to justify easing off. The second is an emotional negotiation habit. Instead of following through on what you decided earlier, you renegotiate based on how you feel in the moment. If the energy is low, if the task feels boring, if the result isn't immediate, you start modifying the plan. You shorten it, postpone it, or quietly drop it. The decision is no longer controlled by standards. It's controlled by mood. The third is the incomplete identity loop. You still see yourself as someone who is trying to become disciplined, not someone who finishes what they start. That difference is subtle, but it changes everything. Because when your identity is not fixed, every action becomes optional. You don't feel obligated to follow through, you feel like you're experimenting. And here's how it plays out in real life. You decide to wake up early and work on something important. The first morning, you do it. The second morning, you hesitate. The third morning, you negotiate, I'll do it later today. And by the end of the week, the routine disappears. Not because you couldn't do it, but because these 3 patterns quietly pulled you out. Once you see this, the problem stops being mysterious. It becomes mechanical. And what's mechanical can be changed, but only if you stop treating it like a motivation issue. The first shift you need to understand is this: you are overvaluing the start and undervaluing the middle. Starting feels clean. It feels controlled. There's no resistance yet, no accumulated fatigue, no evidence of difficulty. That's why you're drawn to it. It gives you the illusion of progress without demanding consistency. But the middle is where things change. This is where repetition replaces excitement. Where the outcome is still uncertain. Where effort feels heavier because it's no longer new. And this is exactly where you disappear. Think about something simple, going to the gym. The first few days, you show up with intention. You feel focused. But by the second week, the novelty fades. The workouts feel repetitive. You don't see major changes yet. And that's when your behavior shifts. You start cutting sessions short, skipping days, telling yourself you'll make it up later. But you don't, because you've already disconnected from the process. The issue isn't that the task became harder. It's that your expectation was wrong. You expected the process to stay engaging, but finishing requires you to operate even when it isn't. This is where most people fall into what can be called a novelty dependence pattern. They only stay committed while something feels fresh. And the moment it becomes routine, they interpret that as a signal to stop. But routine isn't a problem. It's the requirement. As Rohn said, discipline is the bridge between goals and accomplishment. The bridge isn't exciting. It's repetitive. It's stable. And most people step off it too early. Now the second shift, you are breaking trust with yourself in small, quiet ways, and it's compounding. Every time you decide something and don't follow through, you create a gap. Not a dramatic failure. Just a small inconsistency. But those inconsistencies stack. You tell yourself you'll work for 1 hour, you stop at 30 minutes. You plan to save money, you spend it impulsively. You decide to have a difficult conversation, you avoid it. Each time, nothing major happens externally. But internally, something shifts. Your standard weakens. Your word loses weight. Over time, this creates a subtle but dangerous identity, someone who starts with intention but doesn't rely on themselves to finish. And once that identity forms, your behavior follows it automatically. A simple example. Someone decides to stick to a budget for the month. The first week goes well. Then a small expense comes up, something unplanned but not necessary. They justify it. It's not a big deal. That one decision doesn't ruin anything. But it opens the door. Now the standard is flexible. And once it's flexible, it's negotiable. By the end of the month, the plan is gone, not because of one big mistake, but because of repeated small ones. This is how unfinished patterns are built. Quietly. Gradually. Without resistance. And here's the part most people ignore. Rebuilding trust with yourself doesn't come from starting again. It comes from finishing something, even when it feels insignificant. Because completion sends a different signal. It tells your mind, this is who we are. We follow through. That's how identity begins to shift. Now the third shift, you are relying on intensity instead of stability. When you start something, you often bring a high level of energy. You try to do more than necessary. You push harder than required. And it feels productive in the moment. But it's not sustainable. So what happens? You burn out, not physically, but mentally. The effort feels too heavy to maintain. And instead of adjusting the pace, you drop the task entirely. This is a pattern of overcommitment followed by withdrawal. You go from doing too much to doing nothing. There's no middle ground. Consider a work scenario. Someone decides to improve their skills, maybe learning something new after their job. The first few days, they study for 2 or 3 hours. It feels intense, focused, productive. But within a week, that pace becomes exhausting. They start skipping sessions. Then they stop completely. Not because they lack discipline, but because they chose a pace that couldn't be maintained. The problem wasn't starting. It was the structure of the effort. Finishing requires a different approach. It requires consistency over intensity. It means doing less than you feel capable of, but doing it every day without interruption. That's uncomfortable for a different reason. It feels slow. It feels almost too simple. But that's exactly why it works. Because it removes the need for constant decision-making. You're no longer asking, do I feel like doing this today? You've already decided. There's a grounded example that illustrates this clearly. A man once decided to improve his physical health. Instead of committing to long workouts, he set a fixed rule: every day, no matter what, he would walk for 30 minutes. No variation. No adjustment. No negotiation. At first, it felt too easy. Like it wasn't enough. But he kept going. Weeks passed. Then months. And without realizing it, he built something more valuable than intensity. He built continuity. The habit stayed. The identity shifted. And eventually, the results followed. Not because of effort spikes, but because of uninterrupted execution. This is the difference you need to understand. Starting is driven by emotion. Finishing is driven by structure. If you keep relying on how you feel at the beginning, you will keep repeating the same cycle. Strong start. Gradual drop. Quiet stop. But if you shift to structure, clear standards, fixed behaviors, non-negotiable completion, you remove the instability that's been controlling you. At that point, finishing is no longer something you hope for. It becomes something you expect from yourself. And that expectation changes everything. At this point, the issue should be clear. You don't struggle with starting because starting protects your identity. It keeps you in a position where nothing has been tested long enough to fail. But finishing removes that protection. It exposes whether you actually follow through or just intend to. And that's why you keep returning to the beginning. It feels safer there. But safety comes at a cost. Every unfinished cycle reinforces a version of you that avoids completion. Not consciously, but through repetition. And over time, that repetition becomes your standard. This is where most people misunderstand discipline. They treat it like effort. Like something you apply when you feel ready. But discipline isn't effort, it's alignment with a fixed identity. It's the quiet decision that certain actions are no longer optional. Not because they're urgent. Not because they're exciting. But because they're yours. Once that shift happens, everything simplifies. You don't debate whether to finish something, you assume you will. The only variable left is how you execute, not whether you continue. And this is where compounding begins to work in your favor. Small completions start stacking. Finishing a task you planned for the day. Following through on a commitment you made to yourself. Closing loops instead of leaving them open. Individually, these actions seem minor. Almost insignificant. But together, they create something stable, evidence. Evidence that you are someone who completes. And once that evidence builds, your confidence stops being theoretical. It becomes grounded in repeated behavior. This is different from motivation. Motivation fluctuates. It depends on mood, energy, environment. But identity, when reinforced through consistent completion, stabilizes. It removes the need to constantly restart. Because you're no longer trying to become someone else. You're simply acting in alignment with who you've already proven yourself to be. And that's where self-respect starts to take shape. Not from big wins. Not from external results. But from the quiet recognition that when you decide something, you follow through. No negotiation. No adjustment. No silent exits. Just completion. At some point, you have to stop asking why things aren't working and start looking at what you consistently leave unfinished. Because that's where the answer has been the entire time. Not in your intentions. Not in your plans. Not in how many times you've started again. In what you complete. There's no dramatic shift coming. No sudden moment where everything becomes easier. The resistance you feel in the middle, that doesn't disappear. You just stop treating it as a signal to step back. You move through it without discussion. And once that becomes normal, something changes quietly. You stop breaking your own trust. You stop resetting your standards. You stop needing to convince yourself to begin again. Because you're no longer someone who relies on starting. You're someone who finishes. And when that becomes your baseline, progress is no longer unpredictable. It becomes inevitable. Not fast. Not impressive. But consistent. And over time, consistency removes the gap between who you think you are and what your life actually reflects. At that point, there's nothing left to figure out. Only something left to continue.